Resource Council and Pocatello League welcome you to tonight's forum, Are We Protecting Our Drinking Water? The League of Women Voters, a nonpartisan political organization, works to educate voters. We would like to remind you that absentee voting has started, and although early voter registration is over, in Idaho you can register to vote at the polls. You will need a government-issued photo ID and proof of residence. Be sure to vote, as your voice counts. Visit our table after the forum for more information about the League, voter registration, or voting. League also works to increase understanding of public policy issues. Leagues at local, state, and national levels have been advocating for water resources, regulatory programs, and strengthening environmental protection since the 1960s. The enactment of the Safe Drinking Water Act in 1986 and the Clean Water Act of 1987 and 1994 were milestones in the League's lobbying efforts to ensure safe drinking water for all. We continue to support regulations to protect the quality of current and future drinking water supplies, including protection of watersheds for surface supplies and recharge areas for groundwater. The lower Portneuf Valley Aquifer is the only source of drinking water for Pocatello, Chubbuck, and North Bannock County. And because we live on top of the aquifer and because there's very little protective soil cover due to the geological history of the valley, our water supply is vulnerable to contamination from human activities associated with industrial, business, and residential practices. In comprehensive plan documents, our local government agencies prioritize the need to maintain and protect our water. But what are we really doing to ensure that our drinking water source, the lower Portneuf Valley Aquifer, is protected? Panelists Sue Skinner, Shannon Ansley, and Harold Hargraves will address this question tonight. Ms. Skinner is a retired environmental protection specialist and has a Bachelor of Science degree in geology from Idaho State University. She worked for 35 years in natural resource management and hazardous waste cleanup with the Bureau of Land Management and the Environmental Protection Agency. Sue is currently the Environmental Policy Advisor for the Portneuf Resource Council and continues to guest lecture at ISU. Ms. Ansley graduated from the University of Idaho with a bachelor's degree in geology and earth science. Currently, she is a senior environmental scientist for Shoshone-Bannock tribes, and prior to this position, she was an environmental hydrogeologist for the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality for 7 years and Idaho National Laboratory for 21 years. Shannon is here tonight representing the Portneuf Resource Council. Mr. Hargraves has been Water Operations Supervisor for the City of Pocatello for 22 years and worked for 30 years at the Pocatello Water Department. He is a lifelong resident of Pocatello, is married, and has 5 children. Harold enjoys spending time with his family and participating in the recreational opportunities that abound in this area. Tonight's panelists will also address your water concerns after their presentation. Please raise your hand if you need a card or have a written question so we can collect them during the presentation. And we would also like to thank Pocatello Community Media for recording tonight's forum. It will be available on YouTube in a few days, so go to Pocatello Community Media YouTube and click videos. And now, let's welcome our first panelist, Ms. Skinner.
Thank you. What we thought we would do is give you an overview of what we're going to be speaking about. But prior to that, I want to thank the League of Women Voters and Portland Free Source Council for organizing this. Our agenda this evening is we're going to be speaking about the Portland Valley hydrogeology. So we're going to talk about our aquifer and what it looks like. We're going to be speaking about drinking water versus wastewater. Our focus this evening is going to be mostly on our drinking water. Pocatello and Chubbuck's drinking water issues. We have many vulnerabilities in our community that many may not know about. The history of the groundwater protection efforts in our community. We've had over 18 years of intense groundwater interest in our community. And then Harold's going to be speaking about the actual infrastructure of our groundwater and drinking water system. So after that, we will have an action item discussion and then hopefully questions from you as well. So with that, let's just get started. So this slide is of our Portland Valley hydrogeology, and it just shows basically looking from Chubbuck towards the gap. This is what the surface manifestation of our aquifer. You can tell on the mountains to the right are the mountains that recharge our aquifer, which is unique. We're very unique in that all of our drinking water comes from pretty much what this slide is showing right here. The mountains to the east or to the left are pretty drought types of mountains. You can tell with China Peak, you know, it's a different type of vegetation than what you see on the west side with the conifers and forested areas. It's pretty much sagebrush on the east side, and that tells you a lot about how our aquifer recharges. The west side is very important for recharge of our aquifer, and I'll get into that a little bit more as well. As you can see in the foreground there, that's the Simplot and FMC facility. That certainly is, that's a Superfund site, the Mashab Flat Superfund site. And we'll get into some of the legacy issues about that as well. So let's go to the next slide. Thanks, Shannon. So why protect our drinking water? Well, water security in the West now is key. And what water security is adequate quantities of water of acceptable quality to ensure human and ecosystem health. As we all know, water is life, and without water, we wouldn't have a city, we wouldn't have farming, we wouldn't have anything around us. So water is really important, but do we really value water? The people, the ecosystems, businesses, economies cannot exist without sufficient and high quality water supplies. So it's quality and quantity that we're concerned about. Let's see. So for here, 100% of our drinking water comes from groundwater. Groundwater, in this slide you can see that it comes from, some people describe it to me as like rivers of water under the ground. Well, it is not that. What we have in Pocatello, in fact, is unique, more unique than this slide, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But this is just a generalized, and you can see that as precipitation works its way down through the soils, you go from an unsaturated area to a saturated area, and that is called groundwater. So it's inside the rocks or the whatever the geology might be, the gravel, that type of thing. And here in Pocatello, we have a very unique situation in that we had the Bonneville flood. So that whole valley that I previously showed was created this unique circumstance here in our valley with huge boulders. Anyone who has seen development, like when the new development out in the Chubbuck area, boulders the size of Volkswagens and that type of thing, that's the type of material that our water's moving through. So because of that, the lower Portneuf Aquifer is very unique and very fast moving. Now that is good in some senses because it moves contaminants along, but it's also difficult to find out how to remediate contaminants in that situation. But we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. We used to drink surface water in Pocatello at the turn of the last century. And in fact, one of the history was, the history of that was that once the Fort Hall ceded the lands to the west of Pocatello, they were just overran with people grazing and cutting trees. And they went to President Roosevelt and asked for some protection because they were drinking surface water at that time. And that eventually became, when the advent of the Forest Service, the Pocatello Forest Reserve, and then what we know now as the U.S. Forest Service lands up to the west in the Mead Creek Forest. So we have this long legacy, and then with technology, we started drinking more drinking water. So here, our drinking water is all from our groundwater. I wanted to show you this slide. This is actually the outline of the Portneuf River watershed. So it goes from the Chesterfield Reservoir down through Lava Hot Springs, through Ecom, and out through Pocatello. All these blue dots are the public drinking water systems within the watershed. It just gives you an idea that we live close to the rivers in our watershed, and that's historical. These public water sources serve 25 people or more. So some of the residential rural areas, like down at Mead Creek, they have their own community water systems. And you can see on the slide that we have several of those in the Mead Creek area. We've got some in the Ecom area. They're very important to protect those public water systems as well. And then we have the city water systems, which are the wells right here in the valley, in the heart, right into those Bonneville gravels. That's where our aquifer is. I wanted to show you this slide because the public water systems are regulated by the state. Privately owned wells, there's over 3,000 of them out there, are private responsibility. So if you have a private well, it's up to you to test your well and make sure that your water is safe and treat it if you need to or not. Now, one of the things that is interesting and scary to me, when I did work for the EPA, I had an individual say, well, you're EPA, I'm on a private well, you're going to tell me if my drinking water is okay or not. Unfortunately, it's private responsibility, and it's up to you, if you're on a private well, to make sure that you're testing your well regularly. So this is what our aquifer looks like. We have the Portneuf Gap here on the southeast side of the slide here, and although it's all one aquifer, it actually has three parts to it. So around Red Hill, you get into the northern aquifer, and the southern part of the aquifer would be out towards the Mead Creek area and the steak farm out there. The eastern aquifer would be above the basalt cliffs in this area, and it would be where Century High School is, that area. This part of the aquifer is more fine sediments. It isn't as influenced by the Bonneville flood as the valley floor is. And our aquifer is shallow in the southern area, and then it deepens towards the north. So those of you who know about the highway pond is the window to our aquifer, as someone pointed out to the city in the 1990s by putting some barrels in there to show how easy it would be to contaminate our drinking water. That has been filled in, and we've addressed that risk somewhat now, except for on really wet years like we just had last year. So you can see that all of our water that we're drinking is from a pretty complex system, and it's very localized. That's one thing that is really wonderful about this area, is that it's local, and we have the ability to actually protect our drinking water through local decisions. And that's really important, because a lot of people's drinking water comes from areas that they have no political control over. So that's just something to think about a little bit as well. This slide shows how the aquifer is recharged. So again, here's the Portneuf Gap, and this is the outline of the aquifer. As you can see, the majority of our recharge area is from the Meat Creek area up to City Creek. So all of the developments on the west side have influence on the aquifer recharge. We have a lot of septic systems on that side, which we'll be talking about later, that we do, and we're going to talk about the nitrates from septic systems and how those are increasing over time. But as we think about growth, we really need to think about, we are already mining this aquifer. In that I mean that we are removing more aquifer, or more water that's coming into the system than is going into the system. So we have inputs of about 7 billion gallons per year. That's on normal years. And then total extraction about 7.8 billion gallons. And the aquifer runs from the south to the north, so it's running in this direction. So you can see how important it is for us to understand and pay attention to what's happening on the west bench and in the southern part of the aquifer, because it eventually makes its way northward into our city's well systems. So water quality, basically our water is safe to drink. The good news is, yes, our water is safe to drink. But we do have contaminants in our drinking water that are there from a lot of issues. We're going to be talking about legacy issues. The heart of our community is Union Pacific Railroad. Union Pacific Railroad operated over 100 years without any environmental regulations, and that is a thoroughfare, so anything that went across those tracks, we have had issues here in the past that have gotten into our aquifer. One of the things that a friend of mine said, in fact, with the EPA that was looking at Union Pacific, he was surprised at the pea soup. He actually had grown up in Pocatello, and he said it's just a pea soup of a lot of contaminants. We're up in the mountains, we're in the upper part of the watershed, we're in Idaho where everything's fresh, those types of things that we have, all these things we love about Idaho, and yet we have a lot of legacy issues. And some of those legacy issues are from our decisions of how we developed our area here. So even though there's detectable contamination in the aquifer source and in your tap water, our water is safe to drink. It's within drinking water standards in most places. Now on private wells, that's a different story. And again, it's your responsibility to figure out whether your drinking water is safe or not, and if it's within the drinking water standards. So with that, I'm going to pass it to Shannon, and we'll go from there.
Okay, just to give everyone sort of a setting of drinking water system versus a wastewater system. I've heard some people be confused regarding
well, don't we treat our water here? And, well, we do. We treat our drinking water, but we treat our wastewater. But just to make it clear to everyone, the wastewater lines are completely different from your drinking water lines. So when you turn on your tap in your kitchen to get a drink, that water comes directly from the series of 17 wells that the city of Pocatello has in their public water system. That water is treated at each well with chlorine to take care of bacteria that is in the groundwater system and maybe within the piping system. So when you turn on your tap, it comes straight from the ground with some chlorine added, and then it comes through the pipes into your kitchen. That's the only treatment that's there for the drinking water. When you flush, when you shower, when you launder, that water that goes down your sink or down the toilet or bathtub is carried by a completely different set of pipes from your home to the water treatment plant that is out by the FMC and Simplot plants. And that water does get treated heavily for many different things, for nutrients, for bacteria, and once that wastewater once it's completed, gone through the treatment system that they have out there, it's discharged into the Portneuf River. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody understood that. Because we live and work, let's see, sorry.
There we go. Go that way. Okay. Whoops. Here we go.
Because we live and work.
Oh, I busted backwards.
I'll let you do it.
There. Okay.
Keep go one more.
Okay.
Because we live and work and conduct business and have industry on top of our aquifer, there have been in years of things that have happened, some regulated, some unregulated, that have caused our aquifer to become contaminated. And as I'll just reiterate, as Sue mentioned, because what you drink is safe. It meets the EPA safe drinking water levels. It's monitored by the Department of Environmental Quality. However, there is detectable contamination. If you go to the next slide. One of the contaminants that we see in our aquifer now is nitrate that comes from septic system effluent. And if you can see on the upper right-hand area, this is a map, it's kind of hard to see, but all the yellow dots are approximate locations of septic systems that are on the west bench of town and some along the east bench of town. And you can see that particularly in some of the areas like Johnny Creek and Mink Creek areas, that there are high density of septic systems. For the city wells that are located along the axis of the valley, I can get it going right. This chart shows a history from 1989 to 2015 of nitrate levels in the Pocatello public water system. The yellow line represents 2 milligrams per liter, or parts per million, which is considered the natural background that you would see in most areas in the country. It's considered natural. The safe drinking water level for nitrate is
10 parts per million. And all of these dots represent different sampling data points, and you can see that in many of the wells and for many years we're approaching the safe drinking water limit. There are some wells, and Harold could probably tell you better than I could, some wells in the past that were as part of the system, the Pocatello Public Water System, where the nitrate level exceeded the safe drinking water limit. The city water system monitors that very closely, and if there is an exceedance, then they're required to take that well out of the distribution system, so no water will be extracted from that well. And I believe I know of at least one well on the south end of town where that has happened. But as you can see, with time, we still are seeing the influence from septic waste that's getting into the public water system. Go to the next one. So septic systems in general, regardless of whether they're old or new, whether they're nitrate reducing or not, all septic systems will put some amount of nitrate into the subsurface. The tanks come out of your home, go into a sludge collection tank, and then the water that's on top of that goes out to a drained field that through pipes that have holes in them. It seeps down through the holes into, and it eventually ends up in groundwater. The issue with if you have a septic system in a rural area and you've got it on a large piece of land, say 5 acres or 10 acres or whatever, you're still going to be putting nitrate into the groundwater at that point, but the dilution happens. If there's only one septic per 5 to 10 acres, by the time it gets into the groundwater, it'll dilute to the point where it's not necessarily going to show up in anyone's private well that's next to it. But in areas like Johnny Creek, where you have a lot of septic systems in a relatively small area, it removes that ability for dilution to occur because you've got septic systems relatively close together. And so that's one of the main problems with septic systems. So go to the next one. We have several recommendations for dealing with the issue of septic systems that came from an effort that Bannock County did that I'll speak about a little bit later, but in the 2010, 2012, the county hosted a study session of technical experts that we call a technical advisory committee. We looked at the issues and the science, what we knew about the valley, and we came up with a series of recommendations that we presented to a citizens advisory committee, and then those recommendations went to the cities and the county. But for septic systems, we recommended that reduce new septics as much as possible, utilizing municipal sewer systems. In particular, the South Johnny Creek subdivision is a particularly high density septic area, and along South 5th, where Sue mentioned where Century High School is, back in the private wells along South 5th area are extremely high in nitrate, some of them 3 times the safe drinking water level. And even though There's a city water line that goes down along South 5th to Century. I believe some people were given the option when that water line went in of hooking up, and but there's also a lot of the private wells are in county property, and they were not excited about hooking up. But they have an extreme problem in the South 5th area. Let's see, review, okay, we'll just skip that one. Yep. So during the, as far as managing septic areas, the Technical Advisory Committee made a recommendation, again, to the local governments that certain areas should have restrictions on septic development without hooking up. The preference would be to hook up to city sewer system. I know that we agreed that larger properties where you would be able to utilize the dilution from a larger property that I mentioned earlier. And I think we can go into the next one. Okay, the other issues that we have in our aquifer, I will go to, this is stormwater discharges that the city has largely made a great effort to regulate stormwater, to keep stormwater from pouring into the river like this. I believe there's some regulations now. We have a permit to discharge to the river. There's some requirements now for keeping stormwater on site, I believe, for new development, rather than letting everything run across our streets and parking lots and going into the river. The other issues that we have here are leaking storage tanks, legacy tanks. A lot of them, the badly leaking ones have been pulled out, but we still have legacy contamination from some of those that are sort of mixing in. One of the large issues that has gone on in the past that everybody might be familiar with was when TCE, which is trichloroethylene, was discovered in some of the wells down gradient of the Fort Hall Canyon landfill, or our landfill out on the south end of town. I believe it was early 90s when that was discovered in the wells, and there was a huge effort to investigate. It was showing up in some of the city public water system wells. There was a huge investigation to figure out where it was coming from, and then a plan of action, which at the time was to build an air stripping collection system, a series of wells just immediately down gradient of the landfill, to collect the water, pump it out, put it through an aeration tower, which would remove a lot of the organic chemicals, and then re-inject the clean water down gradient of the collection system. And the hope was that that system would be taking care of our TCE and actually the other contaminant that's coming out of the landfill is perchloroethylene, which is a dry cleaning chemical as well. What has been determined recently is that aeration, that collection and water treatment system has not been effective. And I believe I have the DEQ just recently produced a fact sheet, Pam, I don't know if, I believe I have copies of the recent fact sheet over on the table. And what has been happening is essentially a reevaluation of the system, not the treatment system, but the groundwater system. Where is the water that's coming out of and it's largely coming out of the old landfill cells before they were lined, not necessarily the new landfill cells.
But there will be a huge, I believe the DEQ representatives here working on that now, and there's working closely with the county on defining what the groundwater system is in this area and the best way to deal with it. So check out the fact sheet over there. As Sue mentioned, the railroad yard is because of the years of unregulated activities, is a huge source, remains to be a huge source of contamination or legacy contamination. And the next one is, that's the last one. Unregulated hazardous materials stored and used by business and industry. For businesses that use a certain quantity, there are regulations if there's sort of a regulatory quantity. If you have in excess of 2,000 gallons, for example, of trichloroethylene, you're required to report that to the EQ. Your storage facilities are required to be examined and make sure that you have secondary containment, that type of thing. But there is a threshold below which there are no regulations. It's usually, smaller quantities, and it's different for different chemicals. In Pocatello, there is a business licensing system, but it does not cover every business. In Chubbuck, their business licensing system covers all businesses, and that has been one recommendation that we've tried to make to Pocatello, is that you need to know where your businesses are that are using chemicals, so that if there are spills or if there's a fire and the city fire department has to respond, they need to know what's burning in that, what chemicals are in that building. Otherwise, you're putting firemen in pretty extreme hazardous conditions, and if they don't know what's there, if they don't know that there's a business that's doing metal work and they've got barrels of solvents, then that's a problem. So as I mentioned, that's been a recommendation of the Technical and Citizen Advisory Committee for Pocatello to implement a uniform business licensing program.
Okay. I'm going to talk about PPCPs, pharmaceuticals, and personal care products. First of all, we are so fortunate to have Idaho State University here, because we know more about our aquifer right now than we ever have before, and we now are testing some of these things. So PPCPs are something called emerging contaminants. I know that many people think that EPA is just the big overreach, but in reality, there are a lot of things that aren't regulated yet, and emerging contaminants are one of those. That is pharmaceuticals and personal care products. We have personal care products that sometimes mimic hormonal cellular structure, so that when I was working in Nevada, we saw something in Lake Mead called endocrine disruption. And that's where male fishes behave like female fishes and females behave like males. And that is something that we're vulnerable to as well. The other thing is with pharmaceuticals is that this isn't just dumping things in the toilet and flushing them and getting rid of them because they expired, which, by the way, we have a very good disposal system next door here at the police department for any of those types of pharmaceuticals. But as we take pharmaceuticals, we do not absorb them all. Many of them are excreted through us, and that goes through in our septic systems and into our sewer systems. But we're just starting to understand some of these chemicals. there are no water quality standards for those. So one of the things that in the 35 years of my career that I was noticing is that when you flush the toilet, you kind of need to know where is that going to, because someone might be drinking it downstream from you. And when you turn on the faucet, you need to kind of understand where that water came from, so that you can educate yourself to have a better idea of what's in here, and recognize there are no water treatment standards for this. So think of the poor people in New Orleans. They are at the bottom of the Mississippi River watershed, and many people use the surface drinking water for drinking water. And in fact, the people of New Orleans do have a higher rate of cancer. And that's been, since the 70s even. So because it drains everything, it drains all of our heartland and our agriculture, everything goes through there. Many of you may have read about the dead zone that's in the Gulf of Mexico. These are chemicals that we may or may not have standards for. So with ISU, fortunately for us, they took a look at this issue. And in 2015, they sampled about 100 private wells up throughout the valley, and they showed that 30% of them contain PPCPs, pharmaceuticals and personal care products. In 2017, just last summer, they sampled all of Pocatello's municipal wells, and the good news is that there were no detections. So again, the aquifer, with its fast-moving aspect of it and its ample water, is kind of a good news in that aspect. However, dilution and proximity, 2015 was a drought year, and with the proximity of shallow wells to septic systems, that may be why the private wells showed more PPCPs than maybe in a wet year. We didn't sample in the wet year. But so the city's wells are deeper, and that also could be a part of it, the dilution factor, and the fact that our wells are deeper. So I just wanted to share with you that the PPCPs that were detected in private wells, and you can see it's kind of an interesting what's out there. Anti-epileptic and mood stabilizers, insect repellents, antihistamine, analgesics for cough relief, non-steroidal anti-inflammatories, ibuprofen, as we all know, selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor, SSRI. Some of the studies nationally, we actually have invertebrates in streams and fishes that are eating those that have high levels of the psychotropic drugs that people take now for mental health issues. So what we don't know is basically how does this affect humans. We're just starting to learn how it affects critters and invertebrates in our streams. It's just kind of interesting. Antibiotics are huge. That's another way of getting antibiotics into our systems. So what's intriguing too is that this basically correlated with the high nitrate concentrations from septic systems. So because of that, this information really told us the story that septic systems are sources of contaminants into groundwater. So for people who think that everything gets filtered out of septic systems, this was a real good example that may not be true. So, and it was Courtney Orr who did her master's thesis on that, and that was just really fabulous. So I'm going to turn it back to Shannon now.
Okay. So why do we care about all this? Why would we need to know? Why are we discussing this? The main reason is that if we get to the point where our public water system is unable to meet the safe drinking water standards, then we will either have to find another source or drill new wells, but new wells will be essentially going into the same bathtub of water. So if we contaminate this bathtub of water, we're going to be in trouble. So what would we do? We will have to require treatment of our drinking water system. A number of years ago, I worked with a previous city manager. It was Greg Lanning, and we did a sort of a back of the envelope estimate of what it would cost to treat if we start exceeding the safe drinking water limit for nitrate, for example. And nitrate is very difficult to remove from water because it's just difficult to take it out. A carbon filter won't take it out. You have to have either a distillation system or a reverse osmosis system. So if the city got to the point where they had to put a reverse osmosis system on a well, the estimate at that time was $500,000 per well per year just to treat one well. So it gets...
For 17 wells.
And we've got 17 wells. So it can get very expensive very quickly if we get to that point, if we don't do things to protect our aquifer. For close to 20 years now, there have been people, different groups and different professors and other public works directors that have tried to sort of mobilize interest and mobilize action in the communities. Back in the 90s and early 2000s, Dr. John Wellhand from Idaho State University and the Idaho Geological Survey worked with Tom Mulliken from DEQ and Steve Smart, who was the Public Works Director at Chubbuck for many years. And their protection goal was to try to get this particular aquifer designated as a sensitive aquifer. It's a legislative designation, and they actually had the data to back up that designation, but at the time, the business community and others were a little bit frightened of it because there's only one other place in the state that has that designation. It's up in Coeur d'Alene, the Rathdrum Prairie Aquifer that flows from the Coeur d'Alene area west into Spokane, crosses the state line. And they had a little bit more higher level of restrictions on requiring certain lot sizes for septic system placement. I can't remember exactly, but they did have some other restrictions. So that anyway, it didn't fly here. So in the late 2010, 2011, Bannock County, and I mentioned this before, coordinated a technical and citizen advisory committee groups, and recommendations were made to the cities and the county, and nothing was enacted from that effort. And starting in 2014, the Portneuf Resource Council has tried to pick back up the effort and work with the county and with DEQ and the cities to try to at least make a start and enact a groundwater protection ordinances in both cities. So that's sort of where we are now. And okay. All right.
Okay.
So
all right. So we'll see if we can get. How do I get out of here? Escape. Well, that's right. And then this up here.
Just a break in line, but since we're really short on time. Well, Sue and Shannon have done a very good job of covering the Pocatello water system and some of the things that we are extremely concerned with, the nitrate issues and some of the other contaminants that have come from the landfill. In addition, we have some other naturally occurring contaminants such as arsenic and things along those lines that we monitor very closely. I can skip this up here, please. We have a very extensive monitoring program. We are very serious and concerned about delivering safe drinking water. Currently, our water system serves about 56,000 people. We have over 17,000 connections on our main lines. We produce between 4.5 and 5.5 billion gallons of water per year, depending on the precipitation that we receive. We have a lot of geographical differences in elevations, which require a lot of different pressure zones so that we don't have too much pressure in one and not enough in others. So that creates a lot of different challenges as far as getting water to all those different areas. Many communities only have to pump their water once out of the ground, and as it comes out of the ground, it also pressurizes, or they'll pump into a tank, which gravity feeds into their system. But some of the locations in our city require that the water be pumped 3 times before it gets to those locations. And so we have a very extensive infrastructure. As was indicated earlier, we have 17 wells which supply all of the drinking water for Pocatello. We have a production capacity of about 45 million gallons per day. The most we've ever pumped in one day is just over 41 million gallons. Fortunately, with the conservation programs and the concern of citizens, our production has dropped considerably. We now typically don't exceed 35 million gallons a day in the summertime, where we used to push 40 quite frequently. That record was made back in the early 90s, so even with the growth of the city, our production levels have tapered off and dropped somewhat because of that conservation. We have a number of employees. We have 45 in the water department that comprise 4 different divisions. We have our administration and engineering that identifies the projects that we need to pursue, and also they design and plan those projects. They also are responsible for the water quality reporting. We have some of the consumer confidence reports back there that we produce every year that we're required to supply the residents. We also have all of that information on the website, so if you have any questions or concerns about what is in your drinking water, that's available online. The other divisions we have is the operations division, and that's the division that I'm a part of. We oversee the pumping and purification of the water, the maintenance of our pumping facilities, as well as our storage facilities. This is one of our newer pumping facilities. This is our Spalding Booster Station, and that provides water to the Highland Hill. So it draws water from the lower system. The wells supply the source, and then this takes water from that and pumps it up to the Highland tanks. This pumping facility here in the summertime will produce up to 6.5 million gallons of water a day, which is between 15 and 20% of what we consume or produce. Next one. This is one of the tanks up in the Highland area. It's a 3 million gallon water tank. We have 15 water tanks here in Pocatello with a combined storage capacity of about 25 million gallons of water. This tank here was painted about 30 years ago, and you can see from that picture that was taken about 2 years ago that the paint is still in good condition. We get in those tanks periodically and clean those and ensure that there aren't any issues, disinfect and make any repairs that may be needed. We also have our transmission and distribution services that is comprises our plumbing crews. As you can see in the top picture in the right there, one of the leaks that we encountered. The plumbing crews go out and take care of those. They also help with the flushing. We like to flush our system periodically to ensure clean water. And then also we have our mainline installation crew that goes through and replaces the deteriorating main lines. Some of the things that we use to identify main lines that need to be replaced, of course, our age, but also we have a very extensive mapping system and monitoring system, and so every time we have a leak, that is logged into our computer system, and we're able to identify areas that are having more leaks than others, and so we're able to use that data to determine which of our main lines are in need of replacement. Also, as the system grows or the city grows, we have the responsibility to provide fire flows, adequate flows for fire protection, and so we have a computer model that helps us to identify deficiencies in our system, and so that's another tool that we use to help us identify piping that may need to be upsized, enlarged, new larger pipes put in, so that we can provide not only water for culinary use, but also fire protection. This graph kind of shows you just how good of a deal water here in Pocatello really is. And the other part of that is what people don't realize, most people don't realize, is that the bottled water industry is not regulated, and so you can actually have contaminants in your bottled water, but the water that the city of Pocatello provides is guaranteed compliant with EPA and DEQ regulations. How's that? We do have some components in our water that we would rather not have, but as was indicated, we do monitor closely and we do not exceed. In answer to the point that Shannon brought up earlier about the two wells that did exceed, one is on the south end of town. That well is a backup well. It hasn't run for a number of years. The only time we actually run it is to sample it. And so that water has never contributed to the system when it exceeded those levels. And the other well, when it exceeded, we were in the process of upgrading the electrical system, so it had been idled for a number of months, and then when we brought it online, in the process we sampled it before we put it into service, and so that again also did not contribute in excess of nitrate to our system. So we've been fortunate that way, and as a result of that, we keep a closer watch on nitrates along with some of these other constituents. So we're very proactive, we're proud of our system, and we have a lot of very valuable employees who do a terrific job for the city of Pocatello and look out for your health. So, thank you.
Sorry that you had to rush that so much, Harold. Let's see. So, what are the actions needed? We came up with, kind of brainstormed a list here. Certainly passed the groundwater protection ordinance for the county and the cities. You know, as Shannon was mentioning, that's taken quite some time to move forward on it. The momentum was lost with the Charlotte fire. The county was moving forward, leadership was great, and we had, you know, it's literally 95% ready to go. And it's just really a matter of just that nudge to continue moving forward on getting a groundwater protection ordinance with the county especially. So continue the infrastructure upgrades. What Harold was talking about with the infrastructure, when you think about 270 miles of pipeline, think about driving by a water pipeline from Pocatello to Boise, and that's our responsibility. That's not anyone else's. That's the Pocatello Water System's responsibility. So it's up to all of us to just be aware that that infrastructure is really important, and we need to make sure that we're taking care of it and maintaining it and building new systems when we need them. The requiring a uniform business licensing program in Pocatello, as Shannon said, Chubbuck has one already, and it doesn't seem to be harming their business community. So, I think we probably need to think about that again and think about business licenses in Pocatello. Educating for hazardous materials use and management. That's a real big one, and that's with the licensing and getting the information about what's in the backyard of people's, businesses and things. I think it was kind of shocking to people that there was the cyanide coyote killers were made here and manufactured in Pocatello. That kind of information should be out there so anyone can know what every business has and is doing. Install municipal sewer lines through the legacy high nitrate areas. Certainly the areas like Johnny Creek and maybe potentially Mink Creek. The good news is that EPA's funding was increased in the omnibus bill that was just signed for something called state revolving funds, and those funds are passed through from EPA to the state, and then local governments can apply for those loans. They're low interest loans to upgrade either wastewater systems or drinking water systems. So we're into an infrastructure mode that if we have shovel-ready opportunities, right now is the time to see if we can compete for that funding. So it's a good time to do that right now. Sewer new developments. We have a lot of rural residential areas that probably should have community septic systems, or start thinking about building sewer lines towards them so that we can hook them up. We still have septic systems within the city limits that as they fail, the city's requiring them to hook up to those, and that's appropriate to reduce the influence of nitrates on our drinking water. Supporting the remediation of legacy contamination. DEQ's been working really hard on the Fort Hall landfill issues. Certainly the Union Pacific Railroad issue is just these legacies long-term that are just sitting out there. It's up to all of us to support and make sure that the county's responsible for that remediation out at the landfill, that they have the resources to do it right, because all of us will drink that eventually. The Union Pacific Railroad, there's legacies all over the United States from them for rail yards just like ours. And it's up to us to make sure that they're called the responsible parties, step up to the plate and do what they need to do. And then continuing research of our aquifer recharge use and vulnerability. As I said before, we're so fortunate to have Idaho State University in our community, because we have a lot of knowledge now, and we can take that knowledge to address the issues facing us. We don't have to wait for anybody else to tell us, because it's our responsibility and we have the most knowledge. And I hope tonight that it leaves you with thinking about, we ought to take care of this. So with that, I think we're going to have some questions.
So the first question is, I'll pass it on to Harold. E. coli concerns that were identified in City Creek. And the question is, do we no longer use water from City Creek in our city water supply? And how does that E. coli affect our water supply?
Okay. Actually, City Creek has never been a supply for the city of Pocatello. It was actually utilized by the Union Pacific Railroad. We still have water rights to the West Fork of Mink Creek and Gibson Jack. And so, to answer that question, E. coli is not a concern as far as contribution to our source. We use all groundwater from wells, and each month we take 60 samples throughout the city of Pocatello to identify bacteria,
Okay.
which we don't have problems with. So.
Okay. The next question, do you have data or anecdotal evidence from private well owners in the Johnny and Mink Creek areas regarding water quality? Are they of concern?
Anecdotally, yes, I would say so. One of the situations that has happened that we had a groundwater ordinance in place up Mink Creek is a municipal. It's a public water system where a residential rural development is proposed to be directly upgradient and adjacent to their drinking system. Now, when they put it in, it was way up in the watershed, and everyone thought, well, this will never have development around it. Well, we need to make sure that that development is done correctly so that it doesn't impact the people already using this public water system type of thing. And certainly the PPCP slide shows that there's evidence of interconnectivity between people and their wells. As a kid who grew up in Idaho, I can't tell you how many people's wells are below their corrals. You know, the corral's uphill, their well's there, and then, their house is below that. If your casing is not secure and it's not, if you have runoff from snow melt, rain on snow thing, it can go right down that well into your drinking water. We also have incidences with our rural areas too of where they might be filling a tank with pesticides, and they go off and do something because the tank's filling. Well, then when they shut off the valve, they don't quite close the valve tight enough, and the next thing they know, the tank's gone. It's empty again. Well, where did it go? Right down their drinking water well. And I know of a specific incidence of that in the Twin Falls County area where I grew up, that it was pretty embarrassing to the farmer, but the sad part was they couldn't use their well for years because of that. And it's just little things like that that are just mistakes that can happen that can cause a risk and a vulnerability to all of us. And that one slide that I showed with the 3,000 private wells, you have to hope that everyone's paying attention to that their casings are maintained, and that the wells themselves are high enough that they're not being inundated with surface waters of any kind of thing. So I think all of us probably who grew up in Idaho have kind of stories about that maybe that could be shared. So.
This one's for Harold. If we are taking more water out of the aquifer than is being recharged, what plan is there to sustain the aquifer?
We have a few options. Of course, the city owns 50,000 acre-feet of Palisades water. We've discussed using Fort Holly irrigation to transfer the water in the wintertime to utilize that for aquifer recharge. We also have water rights. Still, we have water rights on West Fork of Mink Creek and Gibson Jack. We've entertained the idea of purchasing the LDS steak farm south of town and creating something similar to Jensen's Grove that would be utilized for aquifer recharge. We have rights to about 2.5 billion gallons of water on those two streams, which date to the late 1800s, so they're very senior water rights. So we do have some potential uses there.
Okay. And this one's for Sue. How will Pocatello Water address the expansion issues associated with the Northgate development? Maybe Harold can help.
Okay. Well, I'm not sure what they've been looking at, but one thing that I think are legitimate questions are certainly what are the water needs going to be? What are the, as Harold just mentioned, there's water rights, but getting the water where it needs to be, there's, on paper, we have the water rights from Palisades, but that water is not here. And as you saw with our aquifer, we have these little micro aquifer systems, if you will. So I think it's a legitimate question to ask the developers, where's the water coming from and where's the water right, that type of thing, before we allow things to move very far. And the other legitimate question too is, for those legacy issues that we have wastewater treatment needs for, will a development of that magnitude take away the capacity from our wastewater treatment plant that we should be thinking about sewering places like Johnny Creek and maybe the lower areas of Meat Creek to address the legacy issues right above our aquifer recharge, to eventually reduce the costs for treatment of those, treatment on the drinking water wells themselves. Those are all good questions to ask, I think, and I don't know that any of us really know the answers to those, but it's a matter of should we take care of legacies before new development? Can we do them both? If we do that, how does that work, and how will it be paid for? Those types of things. So they're all legitimate questions, I think, and I guess the bottom line is those are kind of the main issues for Northgate.
Do you have something to add to that, Harold, on the?
Yeah, we have drilled 3 test wells up in that area to identify and provide additional sources for that. We're in the process of trying to identify, or they're testing these wells to see how much volume as well as water quality. So we are in the process of securing water for that at this time. There's also another well up there that has adequate water, but it has high levels of arsenic. It does not exceed the MCLs or the safe drinking limits, but it's right there on the edge. So we have some potential sources, and we're moving to secure what's necessary up there.
Okay. This question is in reference to the lead issues that Detroit or Flint, Michigan experienced. What is the quality and safety of the pipes that deliver our drinking water?
Excellent. Every time I hear Flint, all I can think of is knuckleheads. It was quite a huge mistake that they made. Hotel, as I indicated, over the years has been very proactive, and years and years ago identified lead service lines, lead bell joints, things like that, and started replacing those, removing those from their system. And so those have been identified, and it's very rare that we encounter anything like that. Our water, as you all know, is very hard. It's not just hard, it's extremely hard, and that actually provides a great benefit with regards to the lead and copper, because it actually will leave deposits on your copper plumbing service lines, which will help reduce the potential for leaching of copper into your water. And then, of course, where we don't have lead components in our system, or very few that may be out there that we haven't yet identified, but very, very few, that also gets a coating. And so, and also our pH of our water is neutral, so it's not aggressive, so we don't have those issues. So we're very fortunate with what we have here.
The next question is, how would a citizen know if their water comes from a private well, or I assume whether you're on the public water system?
If you get a water bill.
Easy one. And the last question is, what are nitrates? Do they eventually decompose or deteriorate?
Do you want to hit that one?
I'll start, and then you guys can chime in. Nitrate is it's a compound of nitrogen and oxygen, and it forms as at least from a septic system, it forms as a degradation of, is it uric acid. So, for example, fertilizer has urea in it, and as that decomposes, that will form nitrate. We excrete urea in our waste, and as it goes through the septic system, that also will degrade into nitrate. And the same with animal waste. So they do decompose, but not only in certain environments will it decompose to nitrogen gas. They're very mobile. They don't stick to soil particles as it's flowing through the subsurface. A lot of contaminants like metals will stick to soil particles, and with time they'll be not removed but reduced in concentration. But nitrate does not stick to anything. It's very mobile, and it goes right through the groundwater system. Dr. John Wellhan, formerly of the Idaho Geological Survey, has looked at high nitrate areas in several places in southeast Idaho, and what he found is that the nitrate, you can pretty much track it along the agricultural and in the agricultural areas on the Snake River Plain and in many places where there's agriculture, rural development. And what he found is that so the Snake River Plain aquifer is moving in a southwesterly direction and ending up in Twin Falls area, and the nitrate levels increase incrementally. It's an additive effect, so whatever nitrate is in the aquifer around Blackfoot, by the time it gets a little farther down in this area, whatever we're putting in adds to it, and it's an additive effect, so it doesn't get removed, which is why it's such a difficult contaminant to deal with. So,
And if I might, should I show that slide that we have?
sure.
Yeah, we actually thought there might be a question about the nitrate priority areas. So you can see these are the nitrate priority areas in our area. So here's Portneuf Gap, and then on up through Pocatello.
Do you want to explain what a nitrate priority area is?
Oh, it's a designation by the Idaho Department of Environmental Quality that there are high levels, and I'm not sure what the threshold is. Do you know what the threshold is?
It's, Tom, can you help? 50% of the wells exceed.
Well, there's a variety of criteria that go into that designation.
Okay.
That's one of them.
Okay.
50% of the wells exceed.
Half the MCL. Yeah, yeah. So the state of Idaho has designated a number of areas all around the state as having higher nitrate levels. There are no requirements for those areas to do anything in particular other than just to be aware that they're areas of concern. And as you can see, the Black Cliffs area, that's down along South 5th. The other area here is the Mink Creek drainage, and again, this is sort of North Pocatello. And I believe that's the end of our questions. Yep.
Okay. Well, with that, we'll ask Mike Larkin, who is the chair of the Portneuf Resource Council, that's going to close us out.
Let's give these folks a round of applause. I just want to take a minute to talk about the Portneuf Resource Council and what it is. And several of our members are here tonight, besides Sue and Shannon, Muriel Roberts back there, Leanna Leitzinger, Linda Lurek, who am I missing? Linda Engel is somewhere in here. And Chris Stevens. And Chris Stevens wants to take just a second to announce a meeting that she has for tomorrow night.
So I'm here representing the Gateway Coalition for Change, and our goal is to work with other community organizations and start to move some of these areas of concern from conversation to action. And so tomorrow night at the Marshall Public Library in what's called the Children's Room, from 6 to 7:15, we will have a meeting at which Sue will facilitate, and we'll take a look at some of the recommendations for action and begin discussions about how we can create community engagement and community activism around starting to take productive action based on what we heard tonight. So I would welcome you being there to be part of the discussion. If you can't be there, there is a notebook on the end of the Medicaid expansion table, which you're welcome to leave contact information, and we'll keep you posted as we hopefully move down this road to try to create some real forward progress on this and other important issues. And as a final note, in the final days, I'm going to hazard a guess that virtually everyone in this room has already signed the Medicaid expansion petition. However, if somehow I have neglected to harvest your signature, please feel free to sign one of the petitions on your way out. Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Chris doesn't have quite enough to do, so she's also running for county commissioner this fall. A miracle woman. The Portneuf Resource Council is one chapter of 39 chapters in 7 western states. It's under the umbrella of the Western Organization of Resource Councils. There's about 14 to 15,000 members across those 7 states. Our group in Pocatello is relatively new and relatively small. There's about 8 really active members that do the majority of the work. The range of interest and enthusiasm in the Dakotas and eastern Montana is largely agricultural issues and oil and gas issues. As you move into the western part of that region, it tends to be more natural resource issues and environmental issues. But basically, most of the people that I've met throughout the organization are not what you'd typically call environmentalists. They're just people that like clean water, clean air, healthy, productive landscapes, and a lot of ranchers and farmers are also in the organization throughout those 7 western states. Anybody that's interested in joining, there's information over here, an informational brochure with contact information on it. Talk to any of our active members. We typically meet the 4th Tuesday of every month at the SICOG building, the Southeast Idaho
Council of Governments.
What is it?
Council of Governments.
Council of Governments, yeah. Okay, I should have remembered that. And that building is on Center Street. Oh, what did I forget? Thanks to the audience for coming tonight, and again, thanks for the panel. Appreciate your attendance. Thank you very much.